Hello and welcome to Global Lens with me, Parikshit Luthra. Let's get you our top focus this evening. The India-U.S. trade deal remains elusive even after 8 months of talks. Back in February, during Prime Minister Modi's visit to the White House to meet Trump, officials on both sides had said that the deal would be signed by fall. However, so far, neither India nor the U.S. have given any indication of a signing. 5 rounds of talks have been completed for the first phase of the agreement. Meanwhile, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has said that the discussions between India and the U.S. are continuing. Speaking to reporters, he added that several sensitive and serious issues are being negotiated and that it is natural for the process to take time. That's not all. The White House has reiterated President Trump's commitment to strengthening ties with India. U.S. officials said that the president has been in frequent contact with Prime Minister Modi, even as differences persist over trade tariffs and oil imports from Russia. The White House called the India-U.S. partnership one that the president values very strongly. The remarks come only days after Trump claimed India had reduced its purchases of Russian oil, describing New Delhi as being very good on the issue. Remember, ties between India and the U.S. have been under strain since President Trump imposed a 50% tariff on Indian goods, including an additional 25% duty on imports linked to India's purchase of Russian oil. Sample this. According to the Global Trade Research Initiative, India's exports to the U.S. fell sharply by 37.5% between May and September 2025, from $8.8 billion to $5.5 billion, one of the steepest short-term drops in recent memory. The tariffs, which began at 10% in April and rose progressively, have hurt nearly every major export segment. Another survey points out that 65% of Americans now disapprove of the tariff policy, saying it has worsened inflation and hurt the economy. Meanwhile, the U.S. Supreme Court has expressed skepticism about President Donald Trump's tariffs in an ongoing case, examining the legality of the sanctions. Both conservatives and liberal justices questioned the solicitor representing the Trump administration about the scope of the president's authority to impose the sanctions. If the tariffs are invalidated, the U.S. government could owe tens of billions of dollars of refunds to businesses that have paid them. Here's a report.
U.S. Supreme Court justices raised doubts Wednesday over the legality of President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. Conservative and liberal justices alike sharply questioned U.S. Solicitor General B. John Sauer, who defended the legal rationale employed to impose the tariffs. Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law that lets a president regulate commerce in a national emergency. Conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett questioned Sauer's claim that IEEPA's language granting presidents emergency power to regulate importation encompasses tariffs.
Can you point to any other place in the code or any other time in history where that phrase, together regulate importation, has been used to confer tariff-imposing authority?
Liberal Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said IEEPA was intended to limit presidential authority, not expand it.
It's pretty clear that Congress was trying to constrain the emergency powers of the president in IEEPA. So it seems a little inconsistent to say that we have to interpret a statute that was designed to constrain presidential authority, consistent with an understanding that Congress wanted the president to have essentially unlimited authority.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he thinks the administration is winning the argument.
I think it went very well. I think the Solicitor General made a very powerful case for the need for the president to have the IEEPA powers, and I believe that the other side, in a way, fell flat on their face, but that'll be up to SCOTUS.
The Supreme Court typically takes months to issue rulings after hearing arguments, but the Trump administration has asked it to act swiftly in this case.
Joining us now to discuss this further is Mark Linscott, former Assistant USTR and Senior Advisor, USISPF. Thank you very much, Mark, for joining us. It's now been 8 months of negotiations. We were supposed to have a deal by fall. Is the deal looking unlikely at this stage?
Thanks, Parikshit. I would not describe the prospects as unlikely. In fact, I've gone from several months ago being very bullish. I was very optimistic there would be a trade deal. Then we had the reciprocal tariffs and the tariff associated with the Russian oil purchases, and I became much more pessimistic. But since then, there has been an upward trend in the discussions. There have been some important developments. Certainly the nomination and confirmation of Sergio Gore as the next ambassador of the United States to India was a big development. Things have been going forward since then. There's been another round of trade negotiations. I think they've made a lot of progress. So I think that the prospects are good for a trade deal. The timing is what is very difficult to predict. I think it could be by the end of the year, but I've stopped making specific predictions in terms of timing. But I'm optimistic once again.
All right, so you're optimistic that there could be a deal by the end of this year. But what do you think are the remaining sticking points? Because what we hear from different sources is that the negotiations are over. It's now up to President Trump to give a nod.
Yeah, I don't think the negotiations are over. I've heard reports of that, but what I've also heard is that there have been ongoing negotiations, and I think it's important to understand this process. And it's not necessarily unique to India. India is one among many trading partners in which there are negotiations on a trade agreement. There have been some trade deals struck, but sometimes those trade deals with other countries have involved a simple announcement or a joint statement. There's been a sequence of events and developments associated with these trade negotiations. And only last week in Asia, in Kuala Lumpur, when there was announcements of new trade trade developments, did we actually see the text of a legally binding agreement with a particular trading partner. And that was with Malaysia and additionally with Cambodia. The United States and India right now, I think, are trying to jump ahead beyond simply a joint statement or an announcement of a trade deal. They've actually been negotiating the specific terms of a legally binding agreement, even if it's a first phase of a legally binding agreement. So that takes more time to do than simply a joint statement. And I think that's why it's taken so long to get to this point. They're being deliberate. I think they are trying to be very specific in terms of what each side will commit to, and that does take time.
Right. I would also like to ask you, do you expect the biggest irritant in talks, which was Russian oil, from the US side, may now be out of the picture? Because come the 21st of November, we are likely to see Indian refiners stop buying Russian oil, at least directly. So do you think that would take care of US's concerns to a great extent and may provide impetus for a trade deal?
I hope so. There have been several signs that there is increasing alignment between the United States and India on what's happening with Russian oil purchases, and the president's made several positive comments. We've seen those developments in terms of increases in purchases of U.S. Petroleum products. Sergio Gore, again, I think, is playing an important role behind the scenes to move this forward. It won't be it won't be out of the picture until the tariff associated with the Russian oil purchases of 25% is eliminated. And it's not clear when that might happen, hopefully soon. And in fact, I think that has to happen before a trade agreement is concluded and announced. But there's clearly been progress, and hopefully we'll see that 25% tariff eliminated in the near future.
All right. I would also like to ask you about the US Supreme Court hearing on the tariff case. In fact, both conservative and liberal justices sharply questioned the US government representative on the legality of President Trump's sweeping tariffs, and they've also questioned how a power which the Congress should have had and how an emergency power has been utilized in this case. There is also a question of whether these tariffs should be approved and authorized by the US Congress. Now, how do you think this case could impact the tariff strategy, and would it be wise for India to wait for an outcome of this case?
Yeah, the implications of this case are huge. There's no doubt about that, and they go beyond trade and tariffs. They go to the question of broader authority, presidential authority, and the role of Congress in a variety of policy areas, and to what extent the Congress um, has the responsibility to take action and not simply defer to the president. So it's big in that respect, in a broader respect. One way or another, I think the tariffs are going to continue to be around for most countries. The administration, I think, is probably redoubling efforts to develop a plan B. They've anticipated the possibility that they will lose this case and that the Supreme Court might determine that the IEEPA tariffs, or the tariffs that have been justified on the basis of IEEPA, are unconstitutional. So they are looking at other authorities they could use to impose tariffs, whether it's Section 232 or 301. There have been references to Section 338 of the 1930 Trade Act. I mean, there are several legal authorities that the Trump administration may turn to, which may be a little more complicated than IEEPA, but that they may turn to if those tariffs are declared to be unconstitutional with respect to IEEPA. So, I think tariffs will continue. They may have to be reformulated and redetermined, but in the context of India, I think moving ahead, continuing to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement, a phase one bilateral trade agreement, is in the interests of both countries, regardless of the tariffs.
Right.
So I think that it's important to continue those negotiations.
Right. Mark, as you said, the US government has options in case the case on tariffs does not go in their favor. One important thing is that the Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative majority. Number two, if the court strikes down these tariffs as illegal, and even if Donald Trump and the White House have options, what happens in the interim? And then when you have to give a legal structure, make these tariffs foolproof, legally foolproof, would there be any space for reducing them as well?
Yeah, I think it all depends on what the Supreme Court decides. If the Supreme Court decides that the tariffs are not authorized by IEEPA at all, then the administration is going to be looking at other legal authorities. For example, Section 232. We've seen a lot of action under 232, but that requires the Commerce Department to do an investigation on the national security implications in a particular sector, and they've done that with respect to a wide variety of sectors. But if they wanted to extend that, they need to do additional investigations. If it's a 301 investigation, that takes time. There's a process. There's a deliberative process. So, we may find that there are these interim steps that may be necessary if the tariffs are struck down and other legal authorities are needed. But it all comes down to what the Supreme Court decides. It could decide that IEEPA does authorize tariffs, but not in the way that the Trump administration imposed them. And there may be restraints that they identify that have to be have to be followed. So we'll see, and hopefully we'll see in coming weeks, not until the end of June or July. But it definitely is the primary factor, I think, at this point in time, in terms of what happens with the tariffs in the next 4 or 5 months.
Absolutely. That's indeed an important point. We are going to take a short break here, but don't go anywhere. When we return, we'll focus more on how the recent US elections, especially the Democratic sweep in this election, has impacted Donald Trump's tariff and economic strategy. We'll be continuing to speak with Mark Linscott when we return.